morning to the West Coasters. I hope you're enjoying your lunch if you're in the middle of the US, and good afternoon to East Coasters, and welcome all to VPE Thursday. VPE has lined up is Hazmat training, which is very relevant right now, especially with COVID that has done a body slam for us, trying to get all the training that is necessary. This has a very interesting spin on this with the two presenters. We have Clay, that of course is the person with the regulation from the government. So he'll be able to be a good resource for us. What Mike does is he's the one that does the investigations on the court side. So he's a leading expert in the field. If you're a lawyer, you probably know his name. And for the cherry on top, Mike actually is a world-class trainer, both virtually and in person. So he's been a huge asset for the industry. Mike, take it away. And I'm going to go dark and be in the background if you need me.
All righty. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the Virtual Propane Expo for our presentation on instructor-led virtual training versus computer-based training or e-learning with no instructor. So moving right along, we will talk about some of the pitfalls for training without an instructor. And pretty much I think that almost everybody out there in the audience has some kind of thoughts on putting an employee in a room with just a video and having that employee watch a video or go online with no instructor and take an e-learning course without being able to speak to an instructor and get some guidance on that course. So I'll bet you everybody out there has some feelings about that. We're going to also hear from our special guest from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, Clay Greene, and he's going to talk about that hazmat training program in a little more detail. I'm going to just talk basically about how we can protect our company, and we don't want to be in front of a judge or a jury having to say that we put our employee in a room or several employees in a room and showed them a hazmat video. And at the end of that hazmat video, we did ask them questions, and they answered those questions, and we made sure that they answered them correctly. And that was the extent of their training. I know that plaintiffs' attorneys that are out there will have a field day with that. So what about classroom training with an instructor versus training with no instructor? Well, if you're getting involved in virtual training, I don't think I have to say a lot about that because COVID has helped everybody out there understand what goes on in the virtual meeting room and the virtual training room. If you haven't had the opportunity to do anything virtually, I'll just tell you that doing virtual training, I've been doing this for over 5 years now. I've trained thousands of employees virtually. And 5 years ago when I started, I was able to train a lot of my overseas clients where I trained 250 employees from different islands all at the same time. So you want to make sure that if you're going to get involved with virtual training, that your instructor is qualified. And I don't just mean qualified in the material that he's going to teach, but qualified and capable of presenting it virtually. Because it's easy to lose employees, and if you're not familiar with virtual education, it's quite possible that they're not going to learn what you expect them to learn. So we use all the PERC training materials. PERC is our bookstore. And I know Clay is going to talk about the hazardous material training program, which it does say is required within the first 90 days of employment. But what I'm seeing out there, and I'll just keep reminding you of this and hope that you'll remember it, a lot of people that I see, they say, well, we didn't do the training yet. We have 90 days to get it done. So where's the employee? Well, he's out driving the truck. He's delivering propane. Well, he shouldn't be doing that unless he's with somebody that's already gone through this program. So I'll continue to remind you of that, and I'm sure Clay will as well. And don't forget, refresher training is also required. I see a lot of companies don't really track this, and they don't know when that 3 years is up. I'll add that we don't just focus on propane. We have a lot of companies that are out there that have been in oil and petroleum products their entire career and have now gotten into propane. So we also have this hazmat training available to anybody in the petroleum industry, handling gas, diesel, and all that other good stuff. The benefits of virtual training, it is instructor-led. It's available where other programs aren't available. Maybe your region is in an area where you can't, where this training is not available in the classroom. Or maybe it's too far and you have to travel, or it's possibly not provided when you need it. So that helps virtual training become more attractive. In our petroleum side, we do have a petroleum professional driver's manual that's available that helps us guide us through the hazmat training program. Who requires this training? Well, we always hear about NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, and our friends at OSHA, 29 CFR, but don't forget DOT. Clay is going to bring you up to speed on the hazmat side and the required training from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. There's that reminder again about the first 90 days, an excellent book put out by PERC. And remember that PERC is our bookstore. That's where we get all our training materials from. If it's non-propane related, we'll get it from the oil industry. And the biggest benefit of virtual training is no travel, no hotels, and the employees are not required to leave home and they're available to the employer. Once again, I think you got it. We use the PERC materials. The good thing about PERC right now, I got to tell you, for the past year, at least a year, I've not used the book. I use the PDF manuals, and they're fantastic. You can get it at PERC. The download is free, and these electronic PDF manuals, they're fantastic because you could highlight them. You could put bookmarks on it. You could put posters on important sections in the book so you can go back and study for the exam. And you can actually use the search engine. The search engine for the PERC manuals is fantastic. It helps you find anything that you need. And the big thing, these manuals are free. You download them from the PERC website. And free, and free. The rule of threes. So, what do we need to know about e-learning and the law? Well, I'm going to tell you this. Any of the attorneys that are out there, if you want to volunteer for our next session to help us further present on electronic learning and non-instructor-led learning and what some of the legal pitfalls might be regarding that training, I know that I get involved as an expert on training, and I see all the time plaintiffs' attorneys beating up companies and employees in depositions on the extent of their employees' training and how that training was presented to the employee and how it was documented. I don't make this stuff up. You can go to Westlaw, you can go to FindLaw and find this information on these websites. I use Cornell Law a lot. Cornell Law is great for searching 29 CFR, 49 CFR, great resources that are out there. I got this right on the FindLaw website. And as technology changes and training switches from face-to-face classroom training and electronic learning expands, so will the laws and policies around those training programs change. You can go to websites right now where you can find e-learning available and download the curriculum for your employees, but that comes with a fee. And be careful, they come with contracts and agreements as well. Make sure that you read them, understand what's in those training programs, consider how that education is developed and brought to your employees. I know as managers and supervisors, if your employer has given you the responsibility of validating the training and making sure that your employees that are attending these training programs are getting properly trained, Somebody in the company has to know this because it all comes back to the company. Like I said, you can go to the FindLaw website. They have some information on e-learning. And if you're going to do virtual training, there is a website called eLearning Learning and the Learning Guild, where you can take courses in how to present virtual training. As a lot of this training changes over from face-to-face and to e-learning website training, you'll find that federal law and local laws are going to change as it relates to what goes on in the classroom, like it's done for our high school and grade school students. If you're signing up for something electronically and they put a contract or agreement in front of you, make sure that you read it thoroughly. Don't just sign it, because there can be clauses in there like non-competes, where you as a company can't present that to other companies. Some of those legal issues would be fees attached to that training and policies that come along with it. And what is your company's policies and procedures as it relates to electronic training or virtual training? So understand who's responsible. Is it the company that's bringing that e-learning to you, or is it the employer that's responsible to know what's in that e-learning curriculum? What's being presented to your employees? And are your employees that's participating in this electronic distance learning really understanding the material? Can they ask questions? Make sure that if you're signing up for third-party training and they're going to issue you a contract or an agreement, that you read it carefully before you sign it. Know the costs associated to that training and know the curriculum for that training program. Make sure that you don't lose your rights to that material when the course has ended. So what the heck is distance learning? Man, I haven't heard that for decades. Well, it's a way of learning where these classes are broadcasted either in webcasts or over the internet, and you don't have to attend the college or a school to participate in this training. And easily put, distance learning is when the students are separated from their peers and their instructors. In virtual training, we could have 20 or 30 or 40 computers with 10, 15, 20 people in a conference room or training room around those monitors learning virtually, and they could all interact. As it relates to the employer's responsibility, and I guarantee you, one person, one organization that's totally responsible for the education of employees is the employer. Those employees that are receiving this training are held accountable to practice what they've learned. You don't just send an employee to a training program and then have no oversight. Is he really doing what we taught him to do? Or was it just, yeah, let's get this guy trained so it's documented? And forget if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. So too many organizations use third-party trainers, and then after that training is done, there's no accountability or follow-up. And no one in the organization is capable of handling that responsibility. There's no accountability. Workers, trainees must have a clear understanding of what the employer's expectations are. And workers without guidance, workers that don't have direction, they feel lost. And I'll tell you what, your employees want to get educated. They want to do the right thing. I guarantee you that nobody wants to take shortcuts. Managers and leaders, you should have regular safety meetings. Those meetings should be documented, and you should track the progress of your employees. Know that they're putting to use the training that you're giving them and understand the ethical and legal implications of online education with no instructor. We are going to have a follow-up to this training program, so check the VPE to see when this is going to be posted. Attorneys that are attending this class, If you'd like to join us in a follow-up lecture on e-learning with no instructor, we welcome you and ask that you join us for our next lecture on training with no instructors. Prepare the participants that are going to these training programs. Don't just say you're going to an e-learning. You're going to log on, we paid for it. It's going to document that you were there. You're going to get training online and it's going to test you and document that you were tested. Let them know what to expect. Know what's in that training program. Ensure the quality of that education. You need to know what's in that information. And how about the use of cutaways? Man, we've used cutaways forever. And we've showed valves that were cut away. We showed regulators that cut away, tanks, cutaways of tanks, cathodic protection, anode bags, cutaways of the anode bag. And we explain, this is my regulator. There are many like it, but this one is yours. This is the way it works. The inlet is here, the valve is here, the diaphragm moves up, the space gets wider, the gas passes through it. You've explained all that using a cutaway. Today, we show video. You see the gas pass through the regulator. We pause the video. We explain what's going on. We ask if you have questions. We ask if you have any experiences with these components that you want to share with the group. So cutaways is kind of old school. Live instructor-led video, where we can actually show you how these components work. My goodness, well, I'm going to share a video with you. Maybe toward the end, we'll do some show and tell if we've got some time left. But I'll show you how we use those videos for demonstration purposes. One is a generator or an electric motor that I use when I'm doing a CTEP electricity training program. When you want to see the actual armature and the field windings and the brushes. You don't see a cutaway of it. You see how the darn thing works in the video. We can talk about it. So that's all pretty cool stuff. Who requires this training? Well, we know it's always published in NFPA. We know that OSHA 29 CFR. And when you come back and check with the VPE to see when we have our next session on e-learning and non-instructor-led training, we'll talk about a little more about OSHA 29 CFR. And you're going to hear from Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, Clay Greene, and he's going to talk about the hazardous material training today. So you're going to learn about that. And with that, I would like to introduce Clay Greene, our Hazardous Material Program Manager from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. So if there's any questions for me, go ahead and ask, and then I'll just turn this over to Clay. And don't forget, keep an eye on the VPE for the next session on non-instructor-led training and e-learning and how that could impact your company. But more importantly, what can go on in front of the judge and jury and the plaintiff's attorneys will do.
Hey, thanks, Mike. Can you see the screen okay?
Looks good.
I'm going to kind of go into, Mike talked a lot about the other requirements that everybody's going to be dealing with, NFPA, also the OSHA requirements, and I'm going to focus on the 49 CFR side of things and what the DOT actually says you have to do. So everybody pretty much knows these regulations are promulgated by the Pipeline Hazardous Material Safety Administration, and based on the mode of transportation, either FMCSA or one of the modal agencies will be applying these regulations during investigations. And for the highway mode or basically anything involving cargo tanks, that's going to be us at Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. So starting off with the training requirements, I'm just going to kind of go through and do an overview, and then I'm going to kind of go back and tie to a couple of points that Mike was talking about in his presentation, and some of the frequent things we see during investigations when our investigations are looking at the training program for a company to see if it meets with the requirements of the regulations. So kind of going through, we start off with some definitions in our hazardous materials regulation. Some important definitions to deal with as far as training required is, what is a hazmat employer? And hazmat employer is basically a person who employs or uses at least one HM employee, or it could be someone who's self-employed, that transports HM in commerce, causes to be HM to be transported in commerce, designs, manufactures, inspects, repairs, tests, packaging. So that, that's going to cover your folks that are doing cylinder inspections, your folks that are doing cargo tank inspections, anyone that's manufacturing cylinders and that type of thing. So that's kind of a broad definition of a hazmat employer. A hazmat employee is someone who's employed by an HM employer or someone who's self-employed that directly affects hazardous materials transportation safety. So that can be someone that loads, unloads, or handles hazardous material. It can be, again, someone that designs, manufactures, inspects, repairs, test packagings that are transporting HM, or they prepare HM. That could be an office worker working on shipping papers, someone that's responsible for the safety of transporting HM. That could essentially be, a manager over the drivers. It could be the drivers themselves when they operate a vehicle that's used to transport hazardous materials. So you see these definitions in the section of the regulation where we talk about hazardous materials training, which is in 49 CFR Part 172, and it's basically referred to as Subpart H. It starts at 172.700. And that section of the regulation actually goes on to define what training is. And it says in there that it's a systematic program that ensures a hazmat employee has familiarity, and big words will get you, with the general provisions of the subchapter, which is the hazardous material regulation book, and is able to recognize and identify hazardous materials, has knowledge of specific requirements of the subchapter applicable to the functions they perform. Then it covers the emergency response information, they have knowledge of that, some self-protection measures, and accident prevention methods and procedures. So that kind of outlines what a training program is and the scope of what the training section in the regulations is all about. So then who does it apply to? It essentially applies to hazardous material employers having to ensure that all of their employees are trained in accordance with the requirements of the subpart. More or less, if they're not accepted, any hazmat employee, and we'll talk about a few exceptions here in a little bit for new employees coming on board, but anyone that performs a function subject to those requirements, they can't do it unless they've been trained to do that function. And kind of where Mike was talking with the canned presentations that you see a lot of the time that are very general, that we are basically given as the training materials for a carrier's training program when we do an investigation. The one area it always seems to lack in is the function specific area. It may not cover, if you're operating bobtail propane delivery trucks, it may have nothing in the material function specific wise that covers the operation of the shutdown devices that's required. There's several other things regarding driving that may or may not be in there. So that's kind of where we run into those general, not necessarily in non-instructor-led training programs like Mike was talking about, versus one that's specific to your actual company. You want to make sure it's covering all those areas. It can be provided by the employer, or again, you can use a third-party service. And, I'll tell everybody, just like anytime I give a presentation, anytime you're going to use anybody for any type of a reference when you're dealing with either motor carrier safety, hazardous material safety, you want to get references on that person. You want to make sure they know what they're doing. You want to find out, have they represented companies that have been through investigations in the past, and are they knowledgeable? Because anybody can call themselves an expert and go out there and try and sell a bill of goods. So the other aspect here is the HM employer has to ensure that each one of the employees is tested by an appropriate means. And basically that means they have to take some type of a test to make sure that, they covered the material and they had something there. So we got 5 areas that require training. I'm not going to really get too deep into them, but the general awareness familiarization training is basically providing them familiarity with the subchapter, what the HM regulations are all about. These regulations are there to ensure that hazardous materials are transported safely. One of the most important things in being familiar with that are the HM communication requirements. HM communication standards, as you see when you look at the parts on this chart, 172 deals with a lot of communication issues, from the shipping papers to the markings to the labeling to the placards on the transport vehicle to the emergency response information to training and so forth. So ensuring that they have a base knowledge of that, they can recognize what a shipping paper is supposed to look like. They know if the placards are right. The propane industry, you're pretty much using the same ones all the time. And it becomes, talking about function-specific training, it's a little more focused when you deal with LTL or less than truckload freights, because you could be dealing with all types of hazardous materials versus just that one that you deal with every day in the propane for the bulk of everything. So next is the important part, function-specific. It says in here that the employee has to complete function-specific training that covers specific to the functions the employee performs under the requirements of the subchapter. Now, if he's a driver, he's going to need to be familiar with all the driver requirements for transporting hazardous material that are in the hazardous material regulations, along with the motor carrier safety regulations. They have to be familiar again with the subchapter. Now, one thing that a lot of people overlook, if they do deal with a DOT special permit of any type that's issued by FMCSA, there's always going to be a requirement for function-specific training on that special provision. If that special provision allows you to put an IBC with liquid on the back of the truck and then unload it from that truck without taking it off under that special permit, then that driver needs to have training on what that special permit is about. So that is one thing that is often overlooked. We'll see is if there's some type of a special permit they're operating under. The next training is safety training, and this is where you'll see your emergency response information that's required, basically, how they handle or respond to an emergency situation. Measures to protect the employee from the HM, what to do if they've been exposed. Certain hazardous materials are going to have different types of requirements. If you're transporting something that's an inhalation hazard, you're probably going to be required by OSHA and other federal alphabet soup agencies to have a respirator. If you're hauling cryogenic flammable liquids, you may be required to have some types of special clothing and special tools, brass-fitted tools to handle and operate things on the tank. And then also the methods or procedures for avoiding accidents, and then what to do if you have an accident, how to mitigate it, some type of basic training there. And a lot of the time you'll see, some of the OSHA training is going to come into play and meet that. It could or could not be adequate. You just have to look at the totality of what your operation is based on, the overall circumstances of your operation. So then, of course, after 9/11, we had, the HM 232 docket come out, which put all the security requirements in play, which, a few years later, that changed a little bit as well. But basically, all HM employees have to have security awareness training that's going to provide them some kind of awareness of security risks, when to, be aware of your surroundings, that type of thing, looking for anything suspicious. There's a lot of training materials that are available out there on those issues, especially post 9/11. You need to have some kind of component in there to recognize and respond to possible security threats should you encounter one. The last element that's in the training requirements is an in-depth security training, and it's only required now when a company has to have a security plan. So for the propane, the propane industry, for a Division 2.1 flammable gas, it has to be a large bulk packaging. So it'd be more than 793 gallons that would trigger you being applicable to the security plan requirements. So if your company is required to have that plan, they must be trained on the plan and its implementation, and it has to include the company's security objectives, the organizational security structure, the specific security procedures the duties and responsibilities for the employees, and then the actions to be taken if a breach occurs. And very similar to what I was saying on the function specific, this training is almost impossible to be met by anything that is not specifically catered to your company, because this training has to be on your specific security plan. And you're not going to be able to do that and meet that requirement with any kind of a generic, like online type training. It would have to be something specific to your company. So again, that's only required if your company is required to have a security plan. So as far as the summary of training, those are the requirements in those 5 areas that you're required to have the HM training for all of your HM employees on. And then they have to only have the security plan in-depth training if they're required to have security plan. So we talked about the OSHA and other relevant training. There's maybe some from EPA that could meet and satisfy the safety training requirements. It's not necessarily a blanket substitution. It just may meet some of it. You just have to ensure that it's going to be specific to your operation and covering the areas there. So the training requirements you find in 172.704C. So essentially the initial training has to be done for a new employee before he performs that function, unless he's under direct supervision of someone who's already properly trained and knowledgeable, and the training's done in 90 days. A lot of people think that just as long as he is out riding and working with the employee, he's good to go. We ran across an incident back in 2008, 2009, where a cargo tank was unloading anhydrous ammonia, and the guy's first day on the job, he was riding in the truck with a trained driver. And when they started unloading the product, the driver of the truck decided he was going to walk off and go to the bathroom, and just left the guy standing there. The guy had no training. He didn't know nothing. The guy just basically said, if something bad happens, pull that switch. And when the guy went off, the smart hose ruptured, and it started a chain of incidents that went into play where it resulted in a huge anhydrous ammonia leak. And the guy just basically pulled the thing and ran. And when we started going through and talking, the company policy in itself said that they will be under the direct supervision. If the driver leaves and goes off to the bathroom, he's not under direct supervision. So they have to be under that direct supervision unless they're properly trained. Just kind of a worst case example. The recurrent training, they must receive all the recurrent or required training at least once every 3 years. And then the in-depth training has to be done anytime the security plan is revised within 90 days of that new plan if there's some type of a change made. The change could be like a change of a physical location, change of different security parameters like fencing, or the way you're limiting or controlling access to your facility. Any actual change to that program itself would require that updated training. And then there is also an option in the regulations to where you can get relevant training on a new employee from a previous employer, as long as you get all of that information on their training. However, I would caution anybody to use that, because you have to look at exactly what did that employee do at the other company. If the guy drove a gas and diesel truck and then he's coming to drive a propane truck, you may be missing a whole lot of function-specific training that would be required on that driver. And just using that blanket to say, well, I got his training from the other company, may not cover everything that he does. So again, you have to look at the totality in that, because as Mike was mentioning earlier, it's not always the DOT you have to be worried about. It's not always OSHA you have to be worried about. It's the liability if something were to happen. And if it is shown that an untrained employee did something that, through proper training would have avoided an incident or an injury or a death, then, there's going to be ramifications come down for the company and the employer for not properly training that person. So that's why it's important to really take a good, honest assessment of your training program and make sure that all your needs are being met. And not only that, but your vulnerabilities for liability are being covered as well. Because ultimately, the safe transportation of hazardous materials is what we're looking for at the end of the day. So the record keeping, what we'll look at during an investigation is we'll want to see the training record for an employee for the last 3 years, as long as he's employed for 90 days after. A record that's going to basically include the employee's name, the most recent training completion date, the description, copy, or location of the training materials used to meet this requirements. And I heard Mike mention earlier when he was talking to you about reviewing contracts that you may have with a third-party provider. We have encountered this in recent years where someone has chose to quit using a third-party person and they have a training certificate, but when we want to look at the training materials so we can verify the adequacy of the training program, they refuse to provide it. So that puts the company in a bind because we can't really, determine one way or another if they're properly trained. And when we start interviewing the drivers and going through different scenarios, a lot of the times they're not really sure what they did. So it's very important to make sure you can have access to those training materials so that we can see what your training program actually looks like. Then the name and the address of the person providing the training, if you do use someone that's not within the scope of employment at the company. And then the big thing a lot of folks leave off on the certificates is some type of a certification that the HM employee has been trained and tested as required by the subpart. And that's just as simple as, throwing a statement on a certificate or some type of a document or record. But essentially, that is an overview of Subpart H of Part 172 for the HM regulations and what you're required to keep, what you're required to comply with. Mike also mentioned, the electronic records and that type of thing with, the options he has for training materials. Keep in mind that there is also a online regulation database you can go to that the government maintains. It's www.ecfr.gov. And any government regulation that is out there, you can find that and look it up. And everything in 49 CFR is going to be DOT related. And that's my information. If anybody has any questions on anything that we covered, I'll be glad to take a question. If you have a question for something Mike covered earlier.
I just posted that website for you in the comments. So folks have it ready to bookmark it. So Mike, and we also have a question too. Would Zoom polls that have the questions meet the requirements? Ooh, that's a great question. What do you guys think? Is that a great question?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Zoom polls, I don't understand the question.
So exactly what we did in the beginning, where we have the question and then answers, where people can actually pick and choose. Is that considered a test? You can extract it from Zoom.
Yes. So in other words, you can develop the questions in a poll on the Zoom session. They can answer the questions and it gets documented.
Yes, it gets downloaded in an Excel. All right. And we got a couple of more questions. So what's your thought with the Zoom? Because it will be in an Excel. It will have, you can either have it attached to a username or not at all. So of course it needs to be documented of who answered it. Would that be considered a test?
So, and also the questions are related to the material that was covered in the training program. So yeah, that's a test. Absolutely. And Clay, correct me if I'm wrong, if the instructor, and it's an instructor-led class in a Zoom meeting, verbally asks the questions and goes around the room, asking the students to read the questions that are in the book, then it goes around the classroom, and they take their time and answer those questions. The test can be done verbally as well, right?
Yeah, Mike, I believe there's an old FMCSA interpretation that addresses the issue maybe from like 2008, 2009 time frame, but there's no requirement for the test to be actually written. And, I don't see an issue with it, especially with where we're going with technology is, if you can demonstrate somebody attended everything and that, you can demonstrate that they were tested in some kind of a way. Because if you tell me they were orally or verbally tested, I'm probably going to ask you a whole lot more questions. But if you can show me where they actually, took part in a poll or did something like that, I would have no problem accepting it.
So to the person's point that just asked that question, when I do that type of training, I record it in my Zoom room. and I save it in the customer's training file. And as a Zoom participant, you could record that and download it electronically and save it. So if Clay comes in and says, I'm doing an investigation, you're telling me you verbally questioned this guy, but where you verbally questioned the people in the class on the material, you could show it because you videotaped it. Good question.
That is, and that's the way of the future. I mean, we're actually, doing that in-house ourselves. When we do a lot of training now, we're recording it for future use, because when we have employee turnover in positions, especially in hazmat, that's one of the things we'll go back and use down the road. Yeah, I don't see a problem with it. I was trying to find, I think I've got the interp number here. I'll come back to it in just a minute if you want to go ahead if you got another question.
So another question is, are the slides available from this webinar?
Yes, I can get them to you.
All right. If you email them to me, I can send them out for anybody that has entered this webinar. All right.
I will do the same.
Oh, yes. Awesome. Thank you.
I've got an answer for you. So FMCSA Interpretation 08-0023. That is 08-0023. It's question number 4. Asks if the employee has to be tested, and its test has to be in writing with a pass-fail scoring, or if it can take the form of demonstrating knowledge or in peer review. The answer indicates test may be in any form that ensures the employee is able to perform the assigned hazmat duties, is essentially what it says in a nutshell.
Could you repeat that? That was one.
It's FMCSA Interpretation 08-0023. And it was question number 4 in that interpretation.
All right, let's go to the next one. I did not realize that Mike had such a large addition to his house for his Zoom background. All right, Noel also has one. Did I pronounce your name correctly this time? Do you have to retain the test with their answers, or does the test show the questions that they answered to cover? That was another great question.
Yeah, something to show that they were tested. I mean, that interpretation from FMCSA says that you don't necessarily have to have one, but again, the more you have, the better preponderance to show they were trained. Because don't get in the mindset of just trying to have a piece of paper to pass by the DOT or OSHA or whoever. The question is going to be, if Murphy's Law applies to you like it does to me, when it goes, it's going to go epically wrong. If you're that guy like me, you want to make sure you got all your I's dotted and your T's crossed, where if something catastrophic does happen, you've got something to support it. And I mean, that's, keep in mind the regulations are a minimum of what you have. There's nothing wrong with doing more.
All right, I got a couple of more. Okay, let's see. For Clay, if you had to put a number to it, what portion of oil and propane dealers get their training done in-house versus third party in your experience?
I'd say in the South, I really can't, I can't speak for other areas of the country. I would definitely say down here in the South, I would say more than probably 3/4 of them will obtain their training from somewhere else. Most of them will get them from a state association, whether it's Propane Gas Association, a Petroleum Marketers Association, or someone that's affiliated with them. And the benefits there, going back to what I was talking about, the function specific side, when you see, I've run into one of the guys that does a lot of training for the Georgia Propane Gas Association, and he has everything specific for LPG transportation, and then he also has other things tailor-made for different materials. But the keys there are going to be, and one of the things to think about, you may have 10 bobtail trucks in service, and you may have 2 or 3 different emergency shutdown systems on those trucks. And is everybody trained on how they all operate? Those are things to think about, from your liability standpoint, is making sure. But I'd say, down here, I'd say, about 3/4 of them probably have someone outside doing it, because they rely on those associations, because we deal mainly with small crews. Now, your larger bulk transporters, 40, 50 plus, trucks in a fleet, they're going to have somebody dedicated in-house due to driver retention and things like that. They're constantly doing it. So hope that answered it.
All right, I have a couple more. What percentage of propane dealers are subject to a hazmat security plan?
I'd say pretty much anybody that's got a cargo tank. If they're doing home delivery, then they're going to be subject, because the applicability for subpart I is a quote large bulk packaging, which is 793 gallons. So anytime you have a cargo tank, you're going to exceed that and be required to have that. The only time you would probably see a propane company that wouldn't be required to have it is if all they deal with is cylinder deliveries. They don't do any bulk transport at all. So,
And to that point, I think it was the first session that we had at the VPE. We had somebody from the Department of Homeland Security, TSA, do a presentation on security, and they have developed a template that you can download, and you could create your own security plan using that template. So go back to the VPE previous presentations, and you'll see where Department of Homeland Security did that lecture, and they made available that template that they just created. And it's great to use as a guide to help you.
It will be posted tomorrow.
Yeah, if I can add something to that, Mike, I will say, just from some real world experience, when all the security requirements first rolled out, we started seeing people basically using cookie cutter security plans. And those security plans all talked about specific types of signage. They talked about specific types of fences. We're going to have a 10-foot fence, and it's going to have razor wire on top. We're going to have 10 guard dogs, and they got all this stuff. And then you go walk around, and you're in a cow pasture, and you got a wire fence out there, and there's no cameras, no signs. You look at the plan, and it's like, okay, come on, I just needed something, but you need to make it specific. It's a good thing that DHS does have out there, and it meets with their requirements. But just make sure if you put something in there that you are adhering to it, because that's one of the things we find a lot of times. People beef those things up so much they're not necessarily compliant with it. So don't get yourself in trouble, is what I'm trying to say.
I love that. That's a great point, because we always say during training, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. But if it is in writing, you will be held accountable for what you put in writing.
Exactly.
So be careful.
Now, you guys mentioned safety meetings and make sure they're regular. What is the definition of regular? Is it every 3 months, every 3 weeks? What's the definition of regular safety meetings?
I'll throw that one to Mike, because that's more that's more business practice than necessarily a requirement out of the HMR. I would definitely say frequent, because the better communication you have between your employees. When you can have employees come in with best practices or lesson learned on things that went well or went bad, the better all of your employees are going to be if you're communicating well, and you're less likely to have something happen.
Yeah, and that's a great answer. I totally agree. There's nothing that I've read that says you have to do a safety meeting every 2 weeks or every month. However, if you've put that in your company policy and procedure, then you better comply with it.
But what would you suggest? Like, what would be a good practice that if you had to go to a company and you're researching and you get that sigh of relief when you see them doing a safety meeting every
month? Certainly when it comes to an insurance claim or litigation, those monthly safety meetings, providing you use good topics, they'll definitely benefit the company.
And have you ever seen a training, all the different things between the 3 years or 90 days? Do you ever see that in a annual review with the employee? Is that usually, I know that's a business practice, but is that a good place to put the training, is in an annual review with the employee? What I'm saying is, and this may be a business practice, is with all the check marks that we need to check off that the training that has been completed, would a record in the employee's annual review, right? Because they're talking about, other things, but training is a component because they're a hazmat employee. Would an annual review be a good place to say, okay, this year you need to do this, this, and this? And then next year would be, you need to complete this testing, that testing. Is that a good bookkeeping?
Well, when in my slides, when I was discussing training, I did say that you have to know what these guys are being educated on and know where they need additional training. So yes, every year you should develop a training plan.
And an annual review would make sense to have that conversation.
Yes, it could be a great place to have that conversation with the employee. Accountability and oversight. So we've trained you on this, pass these courses, but we'd like to continue your education. You need this, this, and this. Part of the annual review. Yes. Great place to do that.
All right.
And I could throw in a real world scenario on one company I dealt with in the past that really had some issues. The first time I went to visit them, the owner decided that he wanted the drivers to start doing training on a yearly basis rather than every 3 years, because he wanted it fresh on their mind. And the benefit that, when he contacted me a couple of years later, he wanted to have some discussions about some things. The benefit I saw in that was by him doing the more frequent hazmat training, the roadside violations that the drivers were being cited for were non-existent after doing that for a couple of years. His drivers were not getting cited for ERGs or shipping papers not being accessible. They weren't getting cited for marking violations, for placarding violations, dirty placards, thing of that nature. And they really paid attention. They took more, pride in what they were doing. And they felt like, even talking with some of the drivers, they felt like the company was investing in them by doing that. And so there was a huge benefit. Just, that's a real world observation I'd seen from a company, that I saw turn around from poor safety performance to, now they're nowhere near on a radar screen. So
should we treat everybody to the propane song now?
Yeah, and I'll just leave them with one thought, and that is we become complacent with these safety meetings and training programs occasionally, because we're doing them all the time, hopefully, and it really doesn't become memorialized and something that we would remember until we have an accident and those employees end up in depositions. And I've seen those employees that haven't been properly trained or adequately trained get eaten alive in depositions. Training, and more training. Employees appreciate that. They really do.
It's that added value, appreciation. I'm worth it. It's that pulse. So we just want to thank you for joining us for our VPE Thursdays. We'll be sending out the slides for both the presentations for both speakers. I just want to thank Mike, and I want to thank Clay for being fun, because this stuff can be very dry, but it's so important to make sure that we do everything so we're on the right side of the law. So, all right, people are dropping off, and have a great Thursday. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Appreciate you having me.
Thanks, Clay. Nice working with you. It was great.
Yes, sir. Take care, Mike.